here we are back with another video, and today we're going to be comparing the GTX 960 super clocked against its older brother, the GTX 660 super clocked. As you can see, both cards are from EVGA, but the 960 has an aftermarket cooler, while the 660 has the stock cooler or reference cooler. On the 660, we have a single 6-pin power connector as well as two-way SLI capabilities. On the 960, we still have that two-way SLI capability. We also have an 8-pin power connector as well as a dual BIOS switch, which allows us to switch between performance or quiet mode. On the back of the 660, we have our 2 DVI ports as well as an HDMI port and display port. Now with the 960, we get 4K support with 3 display ports, 1 HDMI, and 1 DVI. While testing, the 660 definitely was the hottest card. At full load, it was at 80 degrees Celsius, while on the other hand, the 960 at full load was at 62 degrees Celsius. Spec-wise, the 660 has a core clock of 1046 MHz with a boost clock up to 1111 MHz, 960 CUDA cores, and 2 GB of GDDR5 memory. With the 960, we have a core clock of 1279 MHz, a boost clock of 1342 MHz, 1024 CUDA cores, and 2 GB of GDDR5 memory. For the test bed, I'm using an Intel i7-3770K paired with the H100i water cooler, ASRock Extreme 4 motherboard, 8 GB of Corsair Vengeance RAM, 1 TB Western Digital hard drive, and Windows 8.1 Pro. Alright, for our first test, we have Battlefield 4 at ultra settings at 1920 by 1080. On the 960, we averaged at about 65 frames per second, with a maximum of 90 frames and a minimum of 50. On the 660, we averaged at 55 frames per second, with a max of 80 and a minimum of 20. Dropping it down to high settings at 1920 by 1080. On the 960, we averaged at 105 frames with a maximum of 144 and a minimum of 57. And on the 660, we averaged at 75 with a maximum of 108 and a minimum of 43. Next up, we have Far Cry 4 at ultra settings at 1920 by 1080. And when I was testing this, I was pretty surprised at what the 960 was getting. We were averaging at about 60 frames per second, maxed at 90, and the minimum we saw was 37. And on the 660, we had an average of 37, the max was 50, and the minimum was 26. So definitely a good buy. At high settings at 1920 by 1080, the 960 we averaged at 71 with a max of 99 and a minimum of 48, and on the 660 we averaged at 58 with a max of 50 and a minimum of 26. Next up, we got Watch Dogs, which is very demanding. At ultra settings at 1920 by 1080, the 960 averaged at 47 with a max of 61 and a minimum of 24, and the 660 averaged at 25 with a max of 35 and a minimum of 15. Very intensive. Dropping it down to high settings at 1920 by 1080, the 960 had an average of 55 with a max of 65 and a minimum of 32, and the 660 had an average of 30 and a max of 40 with a minimum of 20. I think for me personally, I liked it better when I dropped everything down because it just played smoother, but to each his own. Moving on to Tomb Raider at ultra settings at 1920 by 1080, the 960 scored an average of 61 frames per second with a maximum of 78 and a minimum of 44, while the 660 averaged at 19 with a max of 27 and a minimum of 14. So it was not playable on the 660. Well, to me it was not playable. Some people might like it. Alright, so at high settings at 1920 by 1080, the 960 scored an average of 116 with a max of 138 with a minimum of 94, while the 660 averaged at 90 with a max of 108 and a minimum of 72. Moving on to Batman Arkham Origins at ultra settings at 1920 by 1080, the 960 scored an average of 63 frames per second with a max of 88 and a minimum of 25, while the 660 had an average of 37 with a max of 59 and a minimum of 22. Dropping it down to high settings at 1920 by 1080, the 960 scored an average of 85 with a max of 111 with a minimum of 28, while the 660 scored an average of 80 with a max of 104 and a minimum of 52. Moving on to our final test of BioShock Infinite. At ultra settings at 1920 by 1080, the 960 had an average score of 69 with a max of 98 and a minimum of 47, while the 660 had an average of 55 with a max of 83 and a minimum of 10. At high settings at 1920 by 1080, the 960 had an average of 119 with a max of 217 with a minimum of 22, while the 660 had an average of 94 with a max of 185 and a minimum of 15. After testing the 960, I'm definitely impressed with what it can do, its capabilities, and how quiet and efficient it runs. If you're someone who's looking to upgrade from your 660 or something below that, I highly recommend this card for the money. I think it's great at 1920 by 1080. And thank you for watching. Please comment, rate, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.